After a brief intermission, Telescope resumes its variations on Glenn Gould, including some memorable moments at the piano in Toronto's Massey Hall and a trip to the northern shores of Lake Superior with Canada's master musician.
I must say. Real clarity in something that is a complicated texture.
Yes, that's
most
true.
Most of it doesn't, and that'll work for us.
Well, with the...
I think that in the early days I was running scared just a bit because, first of all, recordings were something very strange to me at that time, and I was primarily a public concert-giving artist. And that being the case, I wanted to reproduce my best platform efforts in the studio. And that also being the case, I turned out recordings that I'm not terribly proud of today, because I don't think of them as being indigenously good recordings. They weren't conceived with the microphone in mind in the first place. They were conceived with a rather larger space than exists between microphone and instrument. And that's why they don't always work. Some of them do. I can still enjoy the Gould variations up to a point. But I think that I'm now able to conceive of the act of recording as something quite special and particular, and in no sense a reproduction of any other act.
I suppose I never really did want to give concerts. I thought of it as something that had to be got through. I thought of it as something that one must do while endeavoring to establish, I suppose, some sort of reputation which would stand you perhaps in good stead later on. And it didn't seem to me that there was anything very productive even at the time. There was a sense of power which I rather enjoyed when I was 14, 15, 16 years old. That was kind of fun to play before a live, rabid public and give of the best one could and toward which one had practiced for many months. But that wears off very quickly. That's a very thin veneer indeed. And once you start doing that every couple of nights and at distant points and distant lands, the charm and the glamour of that doesn't last very long. It certainly didn't with me. And I became not only thoroughly sick, but I began to feel that it was indeed very unproductive, that I was at best competing with myself. Once I'd begun to make recordings, the most that I could hope would be that my public statement would be as good as the equivalent recording of that work, if I had in fact recorded it. And I often had, because one cheats in giving concerts. You don't explore very much new repertoire. You play the same old, tired pieces that you've tried out on your recorded public as well as on other publics. And one does cheat, and one does try to get by with as little work as possible and play them pretty much the same way, I suppose. And there is an incredible lack of imagination that sets in. There's no longer a need to rely particularly on imagination. And one grows old very quickly. It's a dreadful life.
Jim, what would happen if we had a sort of...
There is a danger, for me anyway, in approaching the medium of recording in a too prepared way. I don't believe in anything that puts upon one a particular pressure at the moment of doing. So for that reason, I wander into a studio quite often unprepared, more or less, and although by the time I leave I have a fair notion of what the work is about, I really often don't have that notion when I first arrive. It gradually assumes its availability as we sort out the gigantic crossword puzzle of what is in fact available from the composite of takes 11 and 9 and all the other mixtures that are now available to us. And from those mixtures we have a performance if we're lucky. And that's why I think that if you go too fait accompli in mind into the studio, you're going to be very, very disappointed, because that's not the way to make recordings.
Back off until you get to...
You have those woodwind passages there.
At which point you begin to restore to normal, and when you get to the second theme sequence, that you quite dry and back to the chamber sound of the opening.
I would be delighted not to sing when I play. It's an awful distraction, I know that. I think it's some kind of endeavor by which to resolve the playing statement into an ideal view of the score, which one, of course, is not able to do, no matter how fine the knife edge that the engineer and the splice editor is going to use. One wants to cut through some area of imaginative resistance and visualize some kind of ideal concept.